of probably 4 or 5, just right off the top of my head, put down on the bottom of their letters, please do not post this on the internet, please do not post this on social media, because literally their life is in danger if it's known what they do in that country, that they are there for the purpose of preaching the gospel and telling people about Jesus. And so still in modern times around the world, there are places that don't have the great liberty that we have here in our country. What we have is still very rare around the world. And let's remember that it's a principle throughout the Bible to remember. The Bible teaches us to remember. Moses said a lot about remembering, and he reminded the people. He reminded the people of their history, of Israel's history. He would remind them of what God had done and how God had brought them out and how God had delivered them. After Moses, we have Joshua. Joshua gathered the people near the end of his life. And at the end of his life, what he was doing was rehearsing what God had done so that they would not forget, so that they would remember what was before them. Stephen in the New Testament, when Stephen was stoned and they were throwing rocks at Stephen for preaching the gospel, Stephen, as he preached that message, he was reminding them of Jehovah God, of Israel's God, the one true and living God, and what he had done for his people. And it's good for you and me to remember and to be reminded of what God has done. And it's not just an exercise in recalling fond memories. Viola and I, for our 20th anniversary, we flew to Boston, and then we drove from Boston to Maine. And there were about 9 of the states there in New England area that we had not been to before. And so we made a little loop over a week's time. We tried to visit all of those, do something in each of those states, in those New England states. And then we ended back in Boston. And Boston has something, it's called the Freedom Trail, and you walk through the city, and you can see some of the predominant places in history. And we were so excited about doing that, and it rained that day. And it was a cold rain, but we'd already set up our mind we were going to do it. And so we walked around as long as we could, and we were both just miserable. Even under an umbrella, we were soaked, and we laughed, and then finally we said, okay, enough's enough. We're going to get sick or something. And so we went back. But there's just so much history. I remember visiting Rhode Island and seeing just magnificent mansions, historical homes, homes that look like there were whole parts of cities that still look like you were living in 1700. I mean, the architecture was the same. The roads were the same, not modern roads. They were banked different ways. It's one of those things you just almost have to see to be able to explain. And those are fond memories. And really, as I studied about America, again, my mind went to those places. Been able to visit Washington, D.C. before and see some of our national monuments in Washington, D.C. And I'm reminded of those. But it's more than just recalling fond memories. It's a call to action to continue to be faithful today. Because we look back at our nation's history and we see those that were faithful for the cause of Christ. Those that fought to protect the freedom and the liberty that we have. And today, in the year 2026, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to continue those things and to continue to protect those freedoms and continue to be faithful today. He writes in that book, here's a direct quote from the book, he said, "A nation that forgets the source of its liberty will not know how to preserve it. And a people who forget the God who blessed them should not be surprised when those blessings begin to fade." And we'll kind of hear things all through the message that relate to that. But this morning I want us to consider the values surrounding the founding of our country. What motivated those that left England to come here to the United States, the New World? What motivated them? What drove them? What were the values that surrounded the founding of our country? And then see how that shaped our philosophies and see how it shaped our actions today. And then kind of at the end of the message, what God has done in the past that it would cause us to live faithfully in the present. Right? We look back at our history and we're reminded of those things and we remember those things. But then it's a call to action for you and me to live those things out faithfully today and continue them in the present. So number one, the faith of our fathers. And I said this would be a different message. It's really kind of a history lesson. as we look back and we remember. So Moses, he could look back to the Bible and recount the history of Israel. But the history of America is modern history. It's not, we don't find it in the pages of the Scriptures, but just to be reminded of how our country began. The first thing, the voyage of the Mayflower. The Mayflower, the first ship just before 1620, or just in 1620, that was going to come over to here. And there were things that kind of predated that, that led up to the sailing of the Mayflower. The Mayflower, a ship that had just over 1,400 square feet of living space. That's probably the size of the average house in America, 1,400 square feet. I'm sure many of you have a house that's bigger than that. 1,400 square feet, that'd be a good-sized house for a family today. But that was the living space for there were 102 passengers aboard the Mayflower. I mean, those were extremely cramped conditions. It was a 66-day trip. This was not a cruise ship of today with all the amenities and all the food that's put on board and refrigeration and stoves and all the different ways to prepare food. No, this was a very rough voyage that would take them from England to the New World. It took 66 days. There was great sickness upon the Mayflower because of the food, because of those cramped conditions. They said that living space had a ceiling height of just over 5 foot. So most full-grown men would have had to have stooped just to be able to be in that. I mean, can you imagine 66 days without being able to really stretch out there in that deck of the living space? It was just very, very cramped conditions. Unlike modern ships, it was much smaller. So the storms on the Atlantic hurled the vessel so violently that at one point the main beam for the ship cracked, and they thought this might be the end. We might not make it to land. One of the men aboard the Mayflower was a man named William Brewster. We'll say a little bit more about him here in just a moment. But William Brewster had a printing press. He had that in England. He was bringing that to the New World, to the New America. And part of that printing press was a screw, but that screw was one that would tighten down, and it would tighten that platen down so that they could make good copies of things in that printing press. It'd be kind of similar. I looked at pictures of that screw. It'd be kind of similar to a jack today. If your car broke down, you put that jack underneath, and as you turn it, it widens out, and it will jack your car up in the air. And so someone said, what about that screw? What about that jack that we have for the printing press? And they went and got that. They found that, brought it out, put it really essentially underneath where the crack was at, and as they screwed that thing out, it was able to hold that crack and that main beam tight enough that they were able to make the rest of the voyage. I mean, this is just an unbelievable history. And for a Christian, for a believer, you say, wow, God was watching over them. Right? Today, sometimes we're driving our car and something happens, and we say, whew, God was watching over us. God was protecting us. Sometimes a tree will fall and just miss a house or just miss a vehicle, and we'll say, the Lord was watching over us. Well, the Lord was watching over them on that trip over on the Mayflower. The largest group that came was a group that were called separatists. We call them pilgrims today. Pilgrims was a name that was coined from William Bradford. William Bradford was the one that wrote of Plymouth Plantation. It was a history of those early settlements. And in his writings, one time he called them pilgrims. Probably he was referencing from Scriptures, where we're called pilgrims in the Scriptures. He called them pilgrims. And later, Noah Webster would make in a speech, or Daniel Webster would make in a speech, he would coin them as pilgrims, those early settlers that came over, and now we still call them pilgrims today. It was a group of Puritans that in that day they were called separatists. And the reason they were separatists is they were separating from the Church of England. Back in England, it was law that if you lived in England, you went to the Church of England. It was mandated. It was mandatory. If you didn't go to the Church of England church services, you could be fined. You could even be imprisoned for not going to the Church of England. And so these separatists, what they noticed was that the Church of England was drifting from the Bible. And so because they were drifting from the Bible, they didn't feel like they could go to that church and worship God in good conscience. And so they began meeting many times in their own homes. William Brewster, mentioned him, he is a man that had the printing press. He would print religious things on his printing press. He would print the Bible. He would print books. He wanted them to know the truth. He began having meetings in his home. He was one of the ones that hosted in-home church services. And the authorities found out about it. He was a man that had a position. He lost his position. He was fined greatly. They told the people that the fines would be worse if they continued to meet, if they did not go to the Church of England. And so this group of people, they said, we've got to leave. We've got to flee. We've got to go somewhere where we can have freedom to worship as we see fit. And so they tried to leave England. They got caught. And so it's a really long history. I'm trying to keep it brief today and not give every detail. But they got caught. They got brought back. They got punished for that. Sometimes that punishment would even include whipping and flogging. And that did not deter them. That actually set even more in their mind, we've got to find another route. We've got to be able to get away somewhere where we can worship freely. So they left. They went to Holland. That time they were successful in escaping. In Holland, though, they noticed right away, although they had freedom to worship, they noticed that their children began to speak Dutch, like the other Hollanders. And so they realized that their kids were becoming like the other kids, and so they said, this is not going to work either. They had heard of a new world, and so they determined that we're going to get some money together, we're going to hire a boat, we're going to hire a crew, and we're going to sail to the new world where we can worship God freely. That was what drove those founding people, the founding settlers, the separatists. Now, the separatists were not the only ones on the ship. We'll get to that in just a moment. And so they make this journey. The main beam cracks. The storms drove them much further north than what they expected to be. So rather than land in the Hudson Bay, it was much further north by Cape Cod. That's where they landed. We call it Plymouth, and that was of Plymouth Plantation, Plymouth Rock. And so they were much farther north. Before they get off the Mayflower, they realize that we've got to have some kind of rules. We're not landed where we thought we were going to land. There they would have been under a charter from King James, but they realized we're not where. So before they ever even got off a ship, they covenanted together that we are going to write a document. It was only about 200 words. It's called the Mayflower Compact. But the Mayflower Compact was going to be a document that would help to guide their government. The other passengers aboard they referred to them as strangers. And the strangers were ones that had come for economic opportunity. So they were not it wasn't just the religious people that were on board. It wasn't just the separatists. There was a smaller number of people that had come for economic opportunity. We can make it big in the new world. We can start a new business. We can start a new life. And so that document, they thought, would govern the way that we live. In other words, they were trying to protect that what we came for will be able to be realized, that we can have freedom to worship. The document opens with the words, the Mayflower Compact. It says that they've covenanted together. They have a much longer title. It's since been shortened. We just call it the Mayflower Compact. But when you get to the opening words, it says, "In the name of God, amen." And that established what they were coming for. It was establishing what they were wanting to do. Without the charter from King James, they declared, it goes on in there to say, to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. They went further, agreeing to enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. And some of the younger people probably have even had that phrase on a test or on a quiz. What was the purpose of the Mayflower Compact? Just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. That's probably a test question, I'm sure, at some level. It closes by stating that they're undertaking, here's the closing words, for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. That was the forming of the very beginnings of a government. Of course, that wasn't the government, didn't have a president. That was just the very first colony. the Massachusetts Bay Colony, those that came over, that very first group. But it would give them the freedom to live their lives according to Scripture and accountability before God. And what we're trying to rehearse this morning and remember this morning is that the founding of our country was by a group of people that were wanting to worship God and wanting to be able to serve God and not be dictated that this is where you have to go to church and this is what you have to believe. And so the next thing is the New England winter. It wasn't where they expected to land. It was actually much colder. New York is cold. Cape Cod, even colder. And so the clothing, the food, the provisions, a lot of the food had been ruined on the trip. The clothing certainly wasn't acquainted for a New England winter. Winter was really already settling in. It was the month of December by the time, so they landed in November, got off the boat in December. They began to make their homes and began to gather provisions. But many of them, probably most of them, had been weakened from sickness aboard the crowded ship. They lacked the proper sheltering. They lacked the proper clothing. And so in his history, William Bradford says this: there died sometimes 2 or 3 of a day. Half of their company died, especially in January and February, being the depth of winter. And so about half of the group was buried on Coles Hill overlooking the bay. Later, history tells us that they leveled the ground. So they made all those burials, but they leveled the ground out because they didn't want the natives to see just how much their numbers had been depleted. They felt like it would make them too much of a target. And so the price of liberty had already been steep. When we say that our liberty it's not just from those that served in the military, and we're thankful for those who served in the military. But going back to the very, very beginnings of our nation, it was a group of people that paid dearly so that we could have the freedoms that we have today, so that we could worship like we're worshiping this morning, have the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. Then a surprising providence. When spring finally came, those half that were able to make it through that first winter, when spring finally came, it brought a providence that they could have never imagined. In March of 1621, a man dressed in native attire greeted the pilgrims in English. There's a native man that is speaking English. That man was a man named Squanto. Squanto, 6 years before, had been taken captive, sold into slavery in Spain. Through the intervention of Spanish clergy, he had made his way to England, where he learned English. Then after several years, he was able to make it back to his homeland. Now we think of this, in God's providence, it is very likely that Squanto was the only man alive, very, very likely, he's the only man alive that knew both the native world and these English settlers. And he was able to teach them, he was able to speak to them, he was able to explain to them how to fish, how to hunt, how to plant crops there in New England. And as they gathered the harvest in the fall of 1621, they set aside a time to give thanks to God for the provision of food and the peace with their native neighbors. That would later be remembered as the first Thanksgiving. And when we see the Thanksgiving paintings and Thanksgiving drawings, we always see the Native Americans, and we see the pilgrims, the Puritans that had come here, and usually a large table of food, and they're giving thanks to God for providing for them. As the people groups began they were not the only ones that came. More would start to come over. There would be others that would come, others that would settle near there. And many of them had come for freedom of conscience. In 1631, there was a young minister that arrived that would alter the course of history. This young man's name was Roger Williams. Roger Williams had received an education from Cambridge, legal training from Sir Edward Cole, practical experience from his time as a minister. And he argued that civil rulers were ordained to govern society, but not the soul. This was it's something that we're familiar with today, modern history, but in those times this was a new idea. He believed that the state should govern outward conduct while the church should shepherd the conscience. Coming from England there, he wrote in one of his writings, he said, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. that we would force people to worship a certain way, that we would force people to go to a certain church. And today, as much as we love Good Shepherd Baptist Church, and as much as we go around and try to invite people to our church, we don't coerce anybody to go to Good Shepherd Baptist Church. We don't force you to stay at Good Shepherd Baptist. We still believe the same things that Roger Williams was standing for and arguing for in that day, that worship ought to be the conscience of your own soul. That you make that decision, you make that choice. He was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but he would start a new settlement, and there's a different group of natives helped him. He was able to survive through the winter. He made a settlement. He called for his wife and his daughters to come, and that new settlement that he would make in what we call now Rhode Island, he named it Providence. Providence. He was saying, God took care of me. That's what providence is. The hand of God and the glove of history. And so he said, God made a way that I could be alive. God made a way that I could make it through the winter. That would eventually become Rhode Island. He would establish the First Baptist Church. But the freedom was not for Baptists alone. It was for all denominations. Everyone could come and everyone could worship freely. Not just the First Baptist Church, but also in Rhode Island, the first Jewish synagogue in the New World had been planted there, because he taught and he fought for and he argued for freedom of worship. That freedom spread. Patrick Henry said it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians. Not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, people of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here. Because you know what a Christian says when we talk about freedom of worship? We don't say, well, that's just freedom of worship for Christians. No, we say that's freedom of worship for anyone. That's freedom of worship for whoever and however you would choose to make your beliefs and your ideology. It's what helped form what would become the United States. These beliefs, they shaped other colonies and other laws. At a time when most nations had bound church and state so tightly together, this was something completely new, the separation of church and state. And so this freedom to worship, believe, and follow one's conscience without coercion stands as a central liberty of American life. Now, I know I gave a lot of history there, and I condensed it down and talked really fast to get it all in kind of a short amount of time. That's the faith of our fathers. But let's look secondly at the faith for our children. The faith for our children. The faith for our children, we notice that there today, in the year 2026, there's a decline in patriotism. And we have a service like today where we're celebrating our country, we're singing our national anthem, we're pledging to our flag, we're celebrating 250 years of freedom, 250 years of liberty. But yet, nationwide, according to a recent Gallup poll, only 38% of Americans say they are extremely proud to be an American. That's a decrease. That's the lowest numbers there's ever been in our country. Less than 4 out of 10 that would say, I'm extremely proud to be an American. Among younger generations, the number drops to as low as 18 to 23% that are extremely proud to be an American. And so as time passes, the cost of those sacrifices become less visible. So, Pastor, why would you take the time to go through the history of the United States? Because we need to remember our history. We need to remember the sacrifice. We need to remember the conviction. We need to remember what really founded America, what America was really founded upon, why God blessed America, why God has prospered America so much. And we need to be reminded of those things. The First and Second Great Awakening greatly shaped early America and could easily be a whole message in and of itself. The preaching of George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and those men, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, the famous sermon that Jonathan Edwards preached, greatly shaped America. There are churches still today, many here through the Bible Belt, as the gospel just spread like wildfire during those awakenings. The moral foundation today, though, has been weakened. Brother Stephen probably knew that the service was centered on America today. Obviously had not seen my outline, had not heard my notes and what exactly I was going to be preaching on today. But he said that we would turn back to God. The ensemble sang that song, Heal Our Land. Why? Because as Christians, we realize and we look around and realize that Christianity has become a minority for the first time in our country's history. That our moral foundation has been weakened. We see it everywhere. Everywhere we see that morality seems like it's gone out the window. We have abortion, the killing of babies, killing of innocent babies. And the more you read about abortion, just unbelievable. We see the new stuff of gender, transgender, and gender identity, and defining. We've defined, in modern times, we're defining what marriage is, and now we're even defining what a man and a woman are, or trying to redefine what those things are. The moral foundation has been weakened, and so has the gratitude and the unity for what we had. Those that are thankful, God, thank you for our country. God, thank you for our freedoms. God, thank you for the unity has been destroyed. I feel like in my lifetime, our country is more divided than I can ever remember. We have such a divided country. Revisionist historians have a desire to rewrite history, to change the narrative of history, to tell it in a completely different way. When I went to regular college, I was going to be a school teacher. And my history was my area, social studies. You picked one primary area, 3 secondary areas, and so my primary history area was U.S. history. I had to take, I don't remember how many credit hours, but several credit hours of U.S. history. I had regular U.S. history, modern U.S. history, war U.S. history, all different things that I studied in U.S. history. But a lot of that was trying to rewrite what I had heard growing up. They call it revisionist history. They rewrite, they change the narrative of the story. When earlier generations heard the names of the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, we hear those names. The older people in here, there's an idea of what we've heard about those names, and a kind of a reverence, an honor for those names, thankful for those names, thankful for what they did in our country's history. But younger generations hear those names, and it brings very different feelings. Not feelings of patriotism, but sometimes feelings of anger. Why? Because history has been taught in a different way. It's telling a different narrative. Today, history has sought to vilify many of those men that in our early years, men that were revered and remembered and looked up to. We see a selective teaching of history. Many times that's centered around race, and racism is an ugly sin. It was an ugly sin in the beginning of the founding of our country. It was an ugly sin in Bible times. It's an ugly sin today. James chapter 2, verse 9 says, "But if ye have respect to persons, ye commit sin, and are convinced of the law as transgressors." Slavery, one of the darkest spots on American history. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, "He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death." Now the problem, and I don't really have the time to completely develop this point as much as it should be developed, but the problem is when we go from America has a history that includes racism to America was founded on racism. We just got done taking the first half of the message talking about what America was founded on. America was not founded on racism. You read the stories of now did the history include racism? It did. In context, it's important to remember that slavery was not just an American problem at that time, it was a global problem. Nearly every country, slavery was a problem. But Christians, both in England and the United States, began to speak and to work for the abolition of slavery. And we could rehearse, if we had more time, if the entire message was on this point, we could rehearse the history of those in England that stood against slavery, of those in America that stood against slavery, Christians that were speaking out, using their platform to speak against or speak for the abolition of slavery. Christians today should not hesitate to call out the sin of racism, but neither should we accept a selective telling of our history. Right? We can say that yes, racism exists, it did then, and it still does today. But we can also at the same time realize that we can tell our story without changing the narrative. A generation that is taught to see its nation primarily for its flaws will struggle to appreciate its blessings. If we focus on all of the flaws of America, then we're not going to be thankful for America. But if we look back at the history of America and say there were some things that America did not do right, America was not perfect. When I talk about being proud to be an American, I'm not proud of that part of our history. I'm not proud that we allowed those things. I'm not proud that we did those things. And I can look back in the past and say those things. I can say those things today. There are things today as an American that I'm not proud that our country is doing. There are things that I'm not proud that our country is standing for today. But I can also look around and see the things that I am thankful for. And understand the blessings that I have and the liberties that I have and the freedom that I have because of America. And then the secularization. America was shaped by a people with belief in God, biblical principles, Christian ethics. Researchers at the University of Houston, that's the main university in Texas there, University of Houston. There's others, but that's the one in Houston, University of Houston. They examined 15,000 documents from the writers of the Constitution. They found that 34% of their direct quotes were from the Bible. 34% of their direct quotes were from the Bible. 1/3 of every direct quote was from the Bible. I'm just saying we have a history that our founding fathers were here for the purpose of God. Going back to the Mayflower Compact, that closing line that I gave from the Mayflower Compact, when they wrote that very first document for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. By the year 1776, when the founding fathers were writing the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were men that still 34% of their direct quotes were from the Bible. They were men that believed in God. They were men that were following God. They were men that were cheering on belief in God and freedom of worship. We see John Jay, he was one of the framers of the Constitution, and literally I could read quote after quote after quote from those men, but just a couple that I think will make the point. John Jay, one of the framers of the Constitution, the first Chief Justice, he said, "The Bible is the best of all books, for it is the Word of God and teaches us the way to be happy in this world and in the next." I mean, a man that says something like that is obviously a man that has a belief in God, is obviously a man that has biblical principles, and yet modern historians, secularists today, are trying to erase the Christian part of our history. They're trying to erase the part that those men were men that believed in God and believed in biblical principles. Patrick Henry made many of the famous speeches that is quoted in American history. Here's another quote that Patrick Henry said, "The Bible is worth all other books which have ever been printed." Humanists and secularists today seek to distance the nation from its Christian roots. Many times, sadly, we go to some of our national monuments, our national museums, and it seems that Christianity and a Christian heritage has been downplayed. It's mentioned very little, and what is portrayed and what is championed is a modern ideology, modern ideas, modern narrative that is trying to be pushed. And as Christians, it's so important that we remember our foundation. We remember our beginning. We remember who we were. John Adams, he explained that the Constitution, and this is such a telling statement, we speak much of the Constitution of the United States. He said the Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. You know what that means? That means that if people cease to be moral and religious people, the Constitution doesn't do much good. If you remove that foundation, the structure begins to weaken. And that's what we've seen so many times is the last point here, a weakening Christian influence. It's a misunderstanding of separation of church and state. So many times even amongst Christians today that we misunderstand that phrase, separation of church and state. What does that mean, separation of church and state? Well, first, it's a phrase that's not found in our founding documents. It's found written about the idea. It was written about by Thomas Jefferson. It was written about by some of the other men. It was certainly kind of first promoted by Roger Williams there in Rhode Island before Rhode Island was even officially recognized as one of the New England states. But the concern was not to remove religious influence from society, but it was to protect the church from control by the state. Think about the Founding Fathers. They had left England, where it was the Church of England. You have to go to the Church of England. You have to follow the Church of England. You have to believe like the Church of England. And so they said, no, we want a place where we can go and worship freely, where we're not coerced, where we're not told what we have to believe. That was the freedom that they were seeking. That was the freedom that they were after. The modern interpretation that faith must be kept private, that is not a return to the vision of the founders. That is a departure from the vision of the founders. The Founding Fathers were not trying to separate that so that that could be private. No, they were trying to make that private so that the church, so that the state could not dictate what it was that you could worship and how you had to worship and where you had to worship. And then I mentioned earlier, but it would be difficult to overstate the significance of the Great Awakenings. As our country was founded, as America began to be a nation from 1620 to 1776, 150 years from when they first arrived in that November of 1620 to July of 1776, 150 years had passed, and that forming of a nation, that defining of what we would believe, the structure, and the Great Awakening had tremendous significance in those beliefs and in those practices. The revivals helped stop the tide of atheism and rationalism, what ended up destroying the churches in England. Many have said that our country today is headed toward anarchy or revival. And I believe that's an accurate statement. You look at America today and you say we continue the way we're going, one of two things has to happen. It's either going to deteriorate into complete anarchy, or there's going to be a people that turn back to God and God revives our land like He has in the past. America does not need a political solution. America needs a revival. America needs a turning to God. Now, with all that said, let me come back and kind of wrap it up by saying that patriotism is good. It's good to celebrate our country. It is good to be thankful for our freedoms. It's good to recognize our liberties. It's good to remember those that sacrificed immensely so that we could do the very thing that we're doing today, assembling together and preaching the gospel. Patriotism is what motivated men and women through our history to fight for and to preserve our freedom. It's what compelled the 56 men to sign the Declaration of the Declaration of Independence for a new country. Here's what the Declaration said: conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And they knew that when they signed their name, they were putting themselves at risk. They understood the danger involved in that. They understood the cost involved in that. And you can read the history of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and much of that came to fruition. It does not mean endorsing every action that our country or its leaders take. As Christians, our highest loyalty should always be to God. Remember the apostles, they said we ought to obey God rather than men. We pledge our allegiance to that flag until that would get between us and God. If that gets between us and God, then we say, okay, now we're at a point where I ought to obey God rather than men. And so we can be thankful for America, we can celebrate America, but remember that our ultimate allegiance lies beyond a flag. It belongs to Christ. We benefit from a nation marked by remarkable freedom. I've often said I think one of the best things you could ever do is to travel international, to leave this country and go to another country. And so many times people that get fed up with our country and I hate this country, I wish I didn't live in this country. Well, you go and visit another country and you may change your mind pretty quickly. We have a remarkable freedom. I'm not talking about our hot water, although I'm sure thankful for hot water. Viola and I went to Trinidad, and it was about 95 degrees. I turned on the water, and it was cold, and it felt good. And I'm thinking, okay, when's it going to warm up? I went and asked somebody, they said, there's no hot water in the country. I'm thankful for hot water. I turned my shower on this morning and bumped it over just a little bit hotter, where my white skin turned bright red, because I like the hot water. I like the food. I like when you go to the grocery and there's all the selection and all the different choices that you can pick from. And we are truly a blessed people in that regard. But I'm not talking about the things that we have. I'm talking about the freedom that we have. The freedom to meet together, to assemble together, to worship God. That freedom was secured at a great cost. And it should be used for the furthering of the gospel. I mean, think about, the Bible says, Jesus said, to whomsoever much is given, much shall be required. Think about the great freedoms that we have today, the great liberty that we have today, and that we would squander and waste that opportunity. Any person in here, from young to old, could go and invite somebody to church. You can tell somebody at your school. You can tell somebody at your work. You can invite anybody that you want. You can believe whatever you want. You can say whatever you want. Right? That's the freedoms that we have in this great country. But that we would waste that and squander that and not further the gospel. Our freedoms to worship, to speak, and to gather bring great responsibility. And may God help us to be good stewards of those great freedoms. Tonight I'll preach a little bit more of the practical message about how we live that out, what that looks like in our everyday life as we live for the Lord. But just that we would say it as this way, that God would help us to be good stewards of the great freedoms that He has given us. Let's go ahead and stand this morning, if you would. Ask you to bow your head, close your eyes just for a moment. I know just a little bit longer message today, but honestly I believe it's warranted, as we've come to a point where we're celebrating 250 years of independence, 250 years of freedom, 250 years of liberty. I think we would all do well to stop and remember and reflect and thank God for His goodness. God, I don't know why, but God, thank you that you allowed me to be born here. Thank you that you allowed me to be born in a place where God can be preached. His word can be proclaimed. Most people in America